Hello, and thank you for coming to listen to my talk on poetics and magic. I am Orla Polten, a research affiliate with Poetry Matters at McGill University, and this is a re-recording of a talk I originally gave on the 22nd of November 2024 here at McGill. Some background, I did my undergraduate and PhD at University of Cambridge and my master's at Oxford. And this talk is an early foray into my next research project, a monograph for Cambridge Element's upcoming Literature and Religion series. I became interested in the topic of poetics and magic in modernist verse through my doctoral research initially on English poetry, imitating the rhythms and meters of ancient Greek and Latin. The book that resulted from my thesis, titled English Verse in Classical Meters, Pagan Poetry 1860 to 1930, is forthcoming from OUP. I really hope next year, although they aren't unfortunately known for being speedy. But while conducting a literature review of all the poems I could find in Britain published in this period, imitating the sounds of ancient Greek and Latin, I was struck by the fact that a majority of these poems addressed religious, esoteric, and/or occult themes, and secondly, that a majority of the poets writing English verse in ancient Greek and Latin measures were involved in some way in heterodox religious or spiritual practices. Then, of course, while reading some of the canonical poets in Anglophone modernism, so W.B. Yeats, T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, and H.D., the last of whom will be the central focus of this talk, I was struck by the pervasive claim or suggestion that poetry itself is a type of magic. One such claim is quote one from your handout by W.B. Yeats. Just as the poet enchants and charms and binds with a spell his own mind when he would enchant the minds of others, so did the enchanter create or reveal for himself, as well as for others, the seemingly transitory mind made out of many minds. So in this quote, poetics is an intelligence independent of the poet. The poet enchants and charms and binds with a spell his own mind in the process of enchanting the minds of others. Yeats suggests something about setting language in song or verse, in other words, enchantment, enchantement, setting something in song, transforms the affective reality of everyone who encounters it. And to be clear, by poetics, I mean, following the Princeton Encyclopedia of Poetry and Poetics, the principles and technical processes that govern poetry, such as prosody, lineation, allusion, and so on, that distinguish it from other creative activities. So here for Yeats, poetics seems to form a kind of cognitive substrate that thinks beyond the individual poet as, and I quote, a transitory mind made out of many minds. So my new project explores what is at stake in this insistence that verse itself is magic. By magic, I propose, and I'll go on in more detail, that these poets are recognizing poetic technique as a form of intelligence that operates independently of its creators, intelligence defined simply as the capacity to understand. My thesis posits that when modernist poets invoke the, quote, magic of poetics, they are describing a type of artificial intelligence preceding digital technology that interfaces with the human body and mind to shape the way we think and experience the world. My work on poetics and magic therefore reframes discussions of literature and technology by linking poetic forms to early concepts of non-human, extended, and augmented intelligences associated with literary pattern recognition. The archive of early 20th century modernist verse, in my opinion, offers an especially rich historical resource to recontextualize our current conversations on the post-human and debates about how to understand and engage with AI. My research more generally argues that poetry functions as a form of linguistic technology, or in Greek, techne, which carries its own intelligence, shaping how poets think and write in verse. When I describe poetry as a technology, I am not describing poetry as a computer. Instead, I draw on the ancient Greek philosophical tradition of techne, which refers to an art, craft, or skill, one that collaborates with the human mind in a way analogous to prosthesis, extending thought and creative thought and capacity. While scholars have long recognized the importance of magic in modernism. Indeed, Léon Serret's seminar at the inaugural Modernist Studies Association conference all the way back in 1999 emphasized its importance for the future of the field. Taboos surrounding academic study of magic and its related concepts have persisted until pretty much now. Thanks to the work of scholars across a wide range of fields, including science and technology studies, early modern history, and more broadly, the post-secular turn taking place across the humanities, not to mention, of course, the increasingly absurd state of the world we are living in and the concomitant desire to recover a sense of significance, meaning, or even, yes, enchantment, we have now only just about reached the point where we can take the concept of magic as seriously as do the poets we study. 𝒏𝒈𝒍𝒊𝒔𝒉, in his excellent book Esotericism and the Academy from 2012, explains how the post-Enlightenment Academy defined itself through the rejection of esoteric knowledge and magic practice, in quote 2 of your handout, which I'll read now. Our perceptions of esotericism or the occult are inextricably entwined with how we think about ourselves. Although we are almost never conscious of the fact, our very identity as intellectuals or academics depends on an implicit rejection of that identity's reverse mirror image. It is for this reason that the field of Western esotericism has potentially explosive implications for academic research as a whole. Our imaginal constructs of esoteric or occult otherness are simultaneously constructs of ourselves, and therefore, if they turn out to be different, the question is, what does this imply about us? For this reason, I'm going to focus my talk today on the role of magic in the Poetics of H.D., a pivotal modernist poet who redefined classical myths and feminine poetics through innovative forms corresponding to her mystical and psychological explorations. So here is a portrait of H.D. by Man Ray, demonstrating how central she was to the transatlantic modernist coterie of the early 20th century. I'm going to read H.D. in the context of her analysis with Sigmund Freud in Vienna in 1933 to 34, and the friendship that lasted until his death. For Freud, H.D.'s poetics represented the limit point of what he was able to speak about, and H.D.'s teachings shaped his later engagements with religion and his more private engagements with gender. And though I recognize that Freud is not particularly fashionable today, I personally greatly admire and value him as a philosopher, in other words, a creator of concepts, who evolved over time and grew to understand, like the Wittgenstein of the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, that what we cannot speak, we must pass over in silence. Freud drew out of H.D. a bold commitment to visionary consciousness, mystical experience, and yes, even queer love, which all burst forth from the 3 poems by her I'll be discussing. The Master, written in 1933 to 34, Trilogy, her wartime epic of 1944 to 46, and finally Helen in Egypt, a late long poem rewriting mythology surrounding the Trojan War, published in 1961. H.D.'s letters to her partner, patron, and fellow writer Breyer during her analysis with Freud offer us a unique insight into Freud's late-stage analytic technique, and more importantly for us, how H.D.'s sessions with Freud shaped her process of thinking through and with poetry. In a letter to Breyer dated 19 November 1934, quote 4 on your handout, H.D. describes how a session progressed from dreams of fantastical incestuous pregnancies to a remarkable and perhaps surprising statement from Freud, that poetry is magic. So I'm quoting from H.D. now, writing to Breyer. I had a dream about my baby brother, or sort of Christ child off the Christmas tree, that went back to being 7 and wanting a wonder child with my father. All that seems to please Papa, she means Freud. And of course, there's a lot to unpack there. And he says I have the sort of dreams that he would expect from a woman poet. Also, he says my magic complex is simply poetry, that poetry is magic. But I don't swallow everything he says whole. We argue it out. But all that magic coming up is very fascinating, and he puts it down to magic is poetry, poetry is magic, which is very Wien, as in Vienna, somehow, but stabilizing. So here we see H.D. not immediately accept Freud's formula that poetry is magic. I don't swallow everything he says whole. But she chews over the concept and lets it settle into a curious familial constellation, with Freud as Papa giving H.D. a wonder child, in this passage perhaps unconsciously anticipating the birth of the divine child Horus in Helen in Egypt, which is also alluded to in Trilogy. These later poems also often figure the process of versification as the creator of a divine savior child, a Christ child of Horus, as I mentioned in the latter part of Trilogy, The poem figures itself as Mary before the three magi. It's important to note that H.D. finds this notion of poetry possessing an intelligence beyond the human as comforting, even as she says, stabilizing. She seems to unite the concept of poetry as magic with the Moravian Christian faith of her childhood, placing faith in poetry as a source of divine salvation. Before I move to my close readings of H.D.'s poetry, I must define the term magic and explain why I've emphasized it over related concepts such as esoteric, mystical, occult, etc. In their etymologies, esoteric, mystical, and occult all imply secret or inaccessible knowledge to which one must be initiated. Magic, on the other hand, derives from the ancient Greek via Old Persian magos, Latin magus, referring either in positive or pejorative sense to individuals and groups who instrumentalized secret and/or sacred knowledge. Now, I personally favor the clarity, precision, and rejection of the supernatural in Aleister Crowley's 1929 definition of magic as the science and art of causing change to occur in conformity with will, which you can see in quote 3 of your handout. I've accompanied this quote here with an iconic photo of Crowley in 1917, I believe in ceremonial garb when he was still a member of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, in which he had a major rivalry with Yeats, but that would be a topic for another paper. So note here that Crowley, in the quote I've given you on quote 3 of your handout, lost his will as a transpersonal force, present both in conscious choice and in the unconscious act of breathing, a more universal or divine will to live. This concept, in my view, closely resembling the early modern philosopher Baruch Spinoza's concept of the conatus, or innate striving of every being to persist in its own existence, expressing its essential nature and seeking self-preservation through the unfolding of its power, a concept I'll return to at the conclusion of this talk. Note also that Crowley, like H.D., uses alternate spellings of magic to distinguish quote-unquote real magic from stage magic, as in pulling a rabbit out of the hat. Magic, in my usage, therefore describes a form of power drawing on secret or hidden knowledge that the magus or poet can instrumentalize to whatever end. Interestingly, and this is really interesting, the OED recently, I believe this would have been in the last few months, revised their definition of magic to eliminate any references to the supernatural. Magic in the OED is now, and I quote, the use of ritual activities or observances which are intended to influence the course of events or to manipulate the natural world, usually involving the use of an occult or secret body of knowledge. This, of course, brings the concept more in line with both with historical practices and with Crowley's own definition. So early in H.D.'s memoir Tribute to Freud, we hear how H.D. and Freud mutually impacted each other's thinking about poetics and magic. H.D. writes in quote 5 of your handout, according to his, as in Freud's theories, the soul existed explicitly, or showed its form and shape in and through the medium of the mind and the body as affected by the mind's ecstasies or disorders. About the greater transcendental issues, we never argued, but there was an argument implicit in our very bones. We had come together in order to substantiate something. I did not know what. There was something that was beating in my brain. I do not say my heart, my brain. I wanted it to be let out. I wanted to free myself of repetitive thoughts and experiences, my own and those of many of my contemporaries. In this passage, H.D. emphasizes the flashpoints of her dialogues with Freud as physical phenomena. The argument was implicit in our very bones. I've accompanied this quotation here with a photo of Freud's collection of antiquities, principally gods of the ancient Mediterranean, to emphasize how Freud and H.D. shared a sort of substrate of mythological thinking, which H.D. would make explicit in her later work. We can observe more clearly in H.D.'s short poem, The Master, composed during and immediately after her analysis with Freud, that something beating in my brain was the capacity for poetic rhythm to break the repetition compulsion, which she observes in her contemporaries' lives and art, what Freud identified as the unconscious drive to reenact unresolved trauma. The poems H.D. wrote during and after her analysis with Freud demonstrate a growing commitment to poetics as linguistic technology capable of transforming the human body and mind's relationship with the natural world. Interestingly, The Master was only published posthumously in 1981. And as Rachel Blau du Plessis and Susan Stanford Friedman point out, both Breyer and Robert Herring were insistent that H.D. print The Master, but in 1935, H.D. refused to release the poem. These scholars suggest that H.D.'s choice to keep the poem private during her lifetime may have been influenced by several factors, particularly the cooling of her relationship with her former fiancé and mentor, Ezra Pound. Although in my view, equally important is the eroticized reverence, both of Freud and of sapphic love in the poem, and the poem's accommodation of the opposition between its reverence for a man, and I quote, beyond all men, nearer to God, he was so old, and its knowledge that Freud's philosophy is perfect because, again, I quote, woman is perfect. But the most important passage of the Master for Analysis, which I've given to you in full in quote 6 of your handout, describes a mutual recognition and process of education, whereby both Freud and H.D. come to understand the power inherent in poetic rhythm. I'll read a segment of the quote here while referring to the full poem. How could he have known how each gesture of this dancer would be hieratic? Words were scrawled on papyrus, words were written most carefully, each word was separate, yet each word led to another word, and the whole made a rhythm in the air, till now unguessed at, unknown. H.D.'s archaized misspelling of rhythm reflects her distinctive spellings of magic, alluding, as Friedman and 𝑬𝒏𝒈𝒍𝒊𝒔𝒉 note, to the realm of the spiritual and the occult. This spelling of rhythm is not a Hellenized transliteration or an authentic archaic spelling. Rather, the addition of the second Y extends the duration of potential performances of this word. The second Y here acting as a vowel to permit a rare double stress in English on the word rhythm. The solemnity, therefore, of the slowed momentum on this word underlines the secret to which the old man of the poem has access. How could he have known how each gesture of this dancer would be hieratic? H.D.'s hieratic here refers both to an ancient Egyptian cursive script, a simplified, quicker to write version of hieroglyphs, which I've shown here in a picture of the Rosetta Stone. This was how hieroglyphs were deciphered. There was ancient Greek script, hieratic script, and hieroglyphs. At the bottom of this image, you can see is hieratic script, and at the top, hieroglyphs. And more generally, hieratic can refer to a formal, stylized, artistic manner, focusing on conveying symbolic or sacred meaning through simplified, idealized forms. So the hieratic gesture of the dancer denotes a formal transformation from writing to the embodied cognition of rhythm. In other words, the poem thinks not through its paraphrasable content, but through rhythm. The rhythm of the poem collapses language and philosophy into a single gesture that affirms H.D.'s victory in argument over Freud. That woman is perfect. The poem then concludes with an encomium or song of praise to a beloved woman. You are a near beauty, the sun. You are that Lord become woman. In this way, the power of rhythm in the Poetics of the Master enacts change in accordance with will. Verse can think in ways humans can't on their own. My previous work has described this aspect of poetry as verse technology. When modernist poets describe verse as magic or incantatory power, they are recognizing its capacity to think independently of its human creators. Verse functions as a kind of artificial intelligence, an intelligence we created, but which operates semi-independently of us, that evolves in its interactions with human intelligence, creating new assemblages through interplay of body, mind, and poem. So H.D. further develops this concept of versification and as embodied cognition in her late long poems, Trilogy and Helen in Egypt. H.D. wrote Trilogy famously during the Second World War while living in London, where she experienced the devastation of the Blitz firsthand. She was struggling with personal trauma and seeking spiritual renewal, so she turned to magical traditions, mythological texts, and her experience with psychoanalysis to frame her vision of survival and transformation. The thesis that H.D. and Freud would interestingly grow to share, that magic is poetry, poetry is magic, emerges in Trilogy as a syncretization of modernist poetics with ancient knowledge, an effort to address the fractured world the poem inhabits. H.D. defines poetics as magic in the opening of Trilogy. Mercury Hermes Thoth invented the script, letters, palette. The indicated flute or lyre notes on the The indicated flute or lyre notes on papyrus or parchment are magic, indelibly stamped on the atmosphere somewhere, forever. For H.D.'s Mercury Hermes Thoth, the syncretized god of writing, communication, and magic, verse leaves an indelible mark on the air. In the Hermetic tradition of magic, the syncretized god was called Hermes Trismegistus, thrice great Hermes, who I've represented here with a 17th illustration from an German alchemical emblem book. The concept that, or the whole complex of Hermeticism in the work of H.D. would be the topic of another talk, and is very important to the evolution of this project. The idea that verse can stamp the atmosphere here is a metaphor for how poetry shapes memory and perception, layering past and future affective experiences over the present moment. Again, when H.D. describes verse like this as magic, she is acknowledging its ability to think beyond the intentions of its human creators. Verse is a technology of indication, which contrasts with the physical tools of expression, the flute, papyrus, parchment, and the invisible pen or stylus, which H.D. alludes to with her repetition of the figure of the sword. I will now read quote 7 from your handout in full. But we fight for life. We fight, they say, for breath. So what good are your scribblings? This we take with them beyond death. Mercury, Hermes, Thoth invented the script, the letters, palette, the indicated flute or lyre notes on papyrus or parchment are magic, indelibly stamped on the atmosphere somewhere, forever. Remember, O sword, you are the younger brother, the latter born. Your triumph, however exultant, must one day be over. In the beginning was the word. Without thought, invention, you would not have been, O sword. Without idea and the word's mediation, you would have remained unmanifest in the dim dimension where thought dwells, and beyond thought and idea, their begetter, dream, vision. So this, of course, is a fascinating passage for many reasons, but I'd like to focus for a moment on the half rhyme of sword and word. In this passage, H.D. alludes to the old saying, the pen is mightier than the sword, in the context of war, but twists that allusion by de-emphasizing the physical tools of expression, the flute, the lyre, the unimagined pen, in favor of the stamp or trace left by writing verse. This magical stamp of writing verse becomes, in H.D.'s work, the sacred capitalized word that manifests the dim dimension where thought dwells, and beyond thought and idea, their begetter, dream, vision. Again, H.D. is presenting verse as a cognitive process that extends beyond human intelligence. She suggests that the begetter of dream and vision is something more or other or beyond the human. The word, Hermes, Mercury, Thoth. In the context of this poem, H.D. here celebrates writing poetry as a way to triumph over the physical destruction of the fires of the Blitz. Earlier in this section, she writes, Thoth, Hermes, the stylus, the palette, the pen, the quill endure, though our books are a floor of smoldering ash under our feet, though the burning of the books remains the most perverse gesture and the meanest of man's mean nature. Thoth and Hermes, as gods of writing and communication, represent a linguistic intelligence extending beyond the human, that gives the poet access to what H.D. calls the dim dimension of dream and vision, the cognitive substrate of poetry that precedes and gives life to the sword, a symbol of violence and communication enacted in the world. This idea of poetry being or giving access to some kind of cosmic intelligence is also part of the philosophy of Hermeticism, an ancient and persistent current in magical systems. It's crucial to understanding H.D., but again, which is far too large a topic to cover right now. In H.D.'s analysis with Freud, the mythological characters of Helen of Troy and Helen of Sparta emerged as figures through which H.D. could explore her own identity, particularly her feelings of otherness, guilt, and creative power, which resonated with Helen's role in myth, both as the cause of the Trojan War and as a figure of enduring allure. Helen in Egypt, H.D.'s final long poem, addresses the mythological tradition, most famously explored in Euripides' Helen, and in Stesichorus' Lost Palinode, that Helen of Troy was a spectral double, or in Greek, eidolon of the real Helen of Sparta, whom Hermes whisked away to Egypt before the Trojan War began. H.D.'s Helen in Egypt uses poetic form to revise the mythological figures such as Achilles, Paris, and Zeus, reframing Helen's story as one of spiritual and psychological reconciliation, offering a critique of patriarchal narratives and a vision of feminine agency beyond historical violence. Helen in Egypt offers the closest H.D. ever wrote to a narrative epic, with plot and characters. And in the passage I will focus on, HD has found herself in a temple in Egypt with a spectral double or eidolon of Achilles himself, whom the gods have also whisked away to Egypt. Here, Achilles fight, they flirt, they puzzle over the hieroglyphs until HD experiences the revelation in quote 8 of your handout, that she herself is the writing. I'll read this quote in full now. We were right. Helen herself denies an actual intellectual knowledge of the temple symbols, but she is nearer to them than any instructed scribe. For her, the secret of the stone writing is repeated in natural or human symbols. She herself is the writing. I said I was not instructed in the writ, but I had only heard of it. When our priests decried papyrus fragments travelers brought back as crude primeval lettering, I had only seen a tattered scrolls, dark tracing of a caravel with a great sun's outline. But inked in, as with shadow, it seemed a shadow sun, the boat, a picture of a toy. I was not interested, I was not instructed, nor guessed the inner sense of the hieratic. But when the bird swooped past that first evening, I seemed to know the writing, as if God made the picture and matched it with a living hieroglyph. How did I know the vulture? Why did I invoke the mother? Why was he seized with terror? In the dark, I must have looked an inked-in shadow, but with his anger, that ember I became, with his accusation made me Isis forever with that child, the hawk Horus. I've accompanied this passage on the slide with an illustration from a German encyclopedia of 1870 depicting the goddess Isis, mother of Horus, with her vulture crown. This passage from HD instrumentalizes verse as artificial intelligence once again by presenting poetry as a medium that operates beyond conscious intellectual understanding, much like an autonomous intelligence deciphering hidden patterns. HD contrasts Helen's lack of formal knowledge of the temple symbols with her instinctive recognition of their meaning, suggesting that verse, like a living hieroglyph, has the capacity to encode and reveal truths independently of human intention, again reflecting Crowley's gloss on his definition of magic, which I gave you on quote 3 of your handout. This interplay then between written symbols and divine figures, Isis and Horus, highlights verse's ability to create new cognitive and spiritual assemblages, aligning human perception with transcendent knowledge through an almost autonomous process of recognition and transformation. The vulture of this passage also alludes to HD's question to Helen, repeated throughout the poem again and again. Are you Hecate? Are you a witch? A vulture? A hieroglyph? The sign or the name of a goddess? What sort of goddess is this? So in Egyptian mythology, the vulture symbolizes divine motherhood, protection, and spiritual renewal associated with the goddesses Isis and also Nut, and often appearing in royal iconography as a guardian figure. And also in Hermetic mythology, the vulture represents alchemical transformation, wisdom, and the pursuit of hidden truths, embodying as a carrion eater the cycle of decay and rebirth, and as a concordance of the material and divine. So I'd like to conclude this talk with a slightly more personal reflection on the topic of poetics and magic. When I was 13, I had a series of experiences that, let's just say, led me to question the nature of reality, and as a precocious young person on the internet, to discover Project Gutenberg edition of Spinoza's Ethics. And that text seemed, for the first time, to fully make sense of the world I inhabited. Spinoza describes intuition as the third or most perfect kind of knowledge, which is the final quote 9 of your handout. There is a third kind of knowledge, which I shall refer to as intuition. This type of knowledge proceeds from an adequate idea of the formal essences of certain attributes of God to an adequate knowledge of the essences of things. Spinoza famously equates God with nature, Deus sive natura, the Latin for God or nature. And in this passage, Spinoza describes a process of knowledge acquisition as the recognition of a correspondence between formal patterns in nature and in the human body. So when I say poetics is a type of artificial intelligence preceding the digital, I mean poetics is a technology of the body. When we think of rhythm, we think of a process of entrainment. When a body or language move in a rhythmic fashion, their internal rhythms, such as neural or semantic patterns, synchronize with external rhythms of prosody and bodily affect, resulting in coordinated behavior and/or enhanced cognitive and affective states. We can describe the thinking emerging from rhythmic entrainment as intuitive or precognitive, a type of knowledge situated in the body and its affects. So I agree ultimately with Gilles Deleuze when he writes, alluding to Spinoza, that we do not even know what a body can do. By focusing on the concept of magic as central to the function of modernist poetics, I want to emphasize how we can understand the praxis of ritualized actions or ceremonies designed to shape events or exert control over the natural world as a form of embodied technology, where the body itself becomes a conduit for enacting change through rhythmic entrainment. HD's work highlights her understanding of poetry as a transformative and autonomous force capable of shaping human thought, emotion, and perception by framing poetry as a form of magic, a linguistic technology that operates through rhythmic entrainment and symbolic resonance. HD challenges traditional boundaries between the human and the non-human. Her work invites us to reconsider verse as a medium of extended intelligence and an ethical tool for reimagining how art can engage with a world far more complex than we can ever apprehend. Thank you.